Welcome back to another Dissidia Final Fantasy Opera Omnia video. My name is Infi, and today we're going to be doing an instructional video mainly aimed towards newer players as well as returning veteran players, or maybe somebody who just wants a refresher on what Chaos is and how to tackle it. So in this episode we're going to be looking on how to prepare for Chaos, what to look out for, and what is Chaos in general, and how do we prepare a team for it. So at the end of any event or lost chapter now, we are greeted with this last icon, which is a golden knight with the two crossed swords, similar down to this one. So if we were to click onto this one, the first thing we see is the quest screen and a quest level of 150. If a quest level is 150, this is an indication that the difficulty is of Cosmos difficulty and not Chaos. So coming out of this, we go back down to this icon and we are now greeted with the quest level of 180, and this will show you that you are now going to tackle a Chaos level stage. On the first tab we are given our missions. The missions are usually generic in nature, but the actual conditions will vary in terms of the amount of turns that are required of you to complete the stage within, and as well as the amount of HP damage you need to not take at the end of the fight. The one at the top, which is to clear without any KOs, pretty much remains unchanged and is pretty much straightforward, so you don't want to die. There are mechanics that revive your characters, such as Y'shtola's EX and as well as Rose's auto revive. However, if somebody dies and is revived because of those mechanics, you will still fail this requirement. The next one is, again as we mentioned, the turns. The turns are a good gauge onto finding out what the pace of the fight is going to be like. In this case, for Fang's Chaos, the clear is within 75 turns, which is actually quite quick. So you know that you're going to be relatively fast paced, you're going to need characters that have a good amount of loaded upfront damage and can burn through those waves quite quickly, because of those are the things that are going to try to slow you down. And the last thing to look out for is the amount of HP damage you can take before failing this requirement. So even if you go over 10,000 damage, if somebody can heal you back up, you will also go down in that score. The one thing that doesn't count is if a friend unit takes HP damage, and if they leave the field without being healed, that HP damage will go against your score and cannot be recovered. The next tab is the scores. So the scores will show overall what score requirement is required to clear the stage altogether, and this is influenced by things like your turns, the amount of HP damage you take, the amount of breaks that you take, the amount of overkills that you can kill an enemy, which is killing them above and beyond what is normally required, and then finally launches. Doing all this or preventing these will help you boost up your score the best to its ability to pass that in the first attempt. And the final tab is your enemies tab. This shows every enemy from your waves of trash to the mid boss to then the final boss. So we can see that we've got the trash waves, we've got the skeleton, and what this shows us is our elemental resistances, weaknesses or absorptions, their weaknesses or even their resistances to certain weapon types, which we'll go over in just a minute, and then their resistances to certain types of debuffs. So if I go over to the actual end boss of this stage, which is the Sahagins, we can see first of all we're given fire, ice, lightning, water, earth, wind, light and dark. In the case of the Sahagin bosses, with the plus icon here that shows that they are actually absorbing either wind element attacks and they also absorb light element attacks. So you don't want to bring any characters that bring either of those two elements. If it had a blue arrow pointing downwards, it would show that the boss was weak to that certain element, and then a red arrow pointing up would show a resistant to that element. In terms of weapon types, we're given melee, ranged, and magic. In the case of this boss, they are not weak or they're not resistant to any type of weapon, which is great in terms of diversity when it means bringing somebody to this fight. And then finally, we see the resistances. In this case, we can see that the bosses are immune to initial down brave, poison, paralysis, and sap. What this means is that any debuffers that you bring to the fight, you will lose some kind of utility with those characters, because part of their kit is to bring these debilitating debuffs to bring down the enemy's defenses or bring down their attack. So you want to make sure to check this, because certain characters, this is part of their kit, and if you're not able to debuff an enemy, you lose a lot of their damage. A good example is somebody like Faris. So Faris actually gets a max brave buff and as well as an attack buff whenever she debuffs an enemy. And if she's unable to do that, she'll lose out quite a lot of her damage potential. And then when we scroll down just a bit further, we are actually granted with a lot more info than we expected to about what the enemy does, what actually element that they can use on you, what type of attack it is, as you can see here, a melee attack or a magic attack, and actually what kind of debuffs they can put onto the party as well. So if we go a bit further down, we're actually shown here also that they have at times where they can increase their power and actually activate certain buffs on themselves. So you know that actually they're going to quite periodically grant buffs onto themselves to make them stronger, faster, and as well as tougher to beat. So you know that from just looking at this that you're going to need somebody that actually can either push those buffs off or actually dispel them completely. So somebody like, in this case, Vanille, Faris, or in this case of this particular synergy, somebody like Tidus that has quite a lot of debuffs tied to one single ability. This is because debuffs and buffs share similar frames, so there can only be 6 buffs or debuffs on a player or enemy at any one time. So when you use a debuff, when an enemy has the maximum amount of buffs on them, it will push one of those buffs off unless it's framed and replace it with a debuff. This is a great way to tackle enemies buffing themselves up if you don't have somebody that can dispel. So the first thing we want to know when we come to actually build a team is that first of all we know that they're going to buff themselves. So again we're given those options: Faris, Vanille, Tidus, or any other kind of debuffer that can apply a lot of debuffs in a very short amount of time. We have people like Emperor who have debuffs attached to all of their skills. However, the majority of his all-in-one debuffs comes from his EX, and that's not too reliable for what we want to actually be achieved. We want somebody who can be able to dispel or get rid of those buffs as fast as possible. So somebody that can do that is absolutely recommended for this. The next thing is that we know, actually going into the fight, that you'll be greeted with 2 of the Sahagin bosses instead of 1. So you want somebody who can either do great single target damage in a really fast amount of time, or somebody that can do either split damage or AoE damage. So we're given quite a lot of actual options in this case, especially now further into the Chaos Age era, but at the time the best person again for this would have been Tidus. So Tidus is really slot efficient in this case for this particular Chaos stage because his ability to apply debuffs, as well as be very quick in his abilities to get those turns into shave the enemy when their brave gets too high. He has great AoE damage off his EX as well, which is a really fast charge as well. So Tidus was absolutely fantastic for this, just because of his pure slot efficiency. The next thing at this time was that the enemies did quite a lot of damage to your party in terms of the amount of brave damage, and a single break within your party could cause a death quite quickly. So in this case, somebody who can keep people batteried up to prevent breaks, or somebody can just prevent it altogether, is usually recommended. At the time of this chaos actually being first released, somebody like Warrior of Light was the best option. So if you go down and find Warrior of Light, here he is. So Warrior of Light is fantastic. I mean, in this case he's amazingly efficient in terms that he only needed to be realized at 0 to 3. At first, in mine now, he's 1 and 3 because the extra brave hits off his EX, but at the time he was a very efficient unit. He still is, to be honest. The shields are very, very useful for most chaos fights. And again, when it comes to the bosses, they gain a lot of brave, and as well as they gain a lot of buffs. So at the time, somebody like Charlotta was a very good unit to bring. And again, this is because she has the ability through her EX to actually use gravity to bring their brave down by a set amount regardless of their defenses. So she's very good in that regards in terms of her reliability. On top of that, her HP Plus has a sap attached to it, which is another debuff, which is fantastic again for chipping away at the enemies' buffs, and as well as chipping away at their brave. So the other things you'd need to consider is, what if I didn't have Tidus? A good replacement at the time was somebody like Cloud. The reason that you would want to bring Cloud in this particular fight is that he has a weapon from his World of Illusions, which I'll touch on a different video, But the World of Illusion weapons are basically weapons with a much better passive for some characters and a kind of mediocre for others. So in Cloud's case, his World of Illusions weapon actually allows him to remove a buff whenever his ability's critical hit. So if you were unfortunate to have somebody like Tidus, there was other alternatives where somebody could just straight up remove the debuffs or buffs that you wanted. Now that we're getting further into the Chaos era, we are offered a lot more options and a lot more diversity, so things aren't as stringent as they used to be. But it is always important that when you're granted the opportunity to see a new Chaos stage, to actually do it a few times yourself to get a feel of actually what the enemy's kind of AI is like. But always kind of look at this. This is so important. So if you actually go down to a different Chaos stage just before we finish this video, I'm going to look at Barrett's Chaos stage just because of I think it's got a weapon type resistant to magic. Okay, so as we can see, by difference to Barrett's Chaos stage, we actually have 85 turns, so we're given a bit more leniency. But the thing that you'll actually find when you enter the stage is that most of the bosses have a high amount of defense or a means of stopping you from doing damage to them, which actually slows down how quick you can actually burn them down. The bosses have a lot of HP attacks, so actually the HP requirement is a lot higher than Fang's Chaos by comparison. And then if we go on to the enemy tab and we press on this, we can see again, in this case they are not immune, resistant or absorption to any kind of elements. But in this case we actually have a weapon type resistance to any characters that could use magic. So when it has a double arrow, this means that it's a much stronger resistance, and it usually means it's, in very specific terms, not to bring magic users. There are cases where certain magic users, for this Chaos in particular, Ultimecia was actually able to be used because of how her abilities worked, but in the most case, magic users will slow you down rather than speeding up the fight itself. The only kind of case that you can get around this is that with a change much recently, is that enchanters who can provide a element to your team as well as a imperil to the enemy, and what an imperil is providing a weakness to a particular element, actually overcomes this weapon type resistance. So for example, somebody like Rydia, who can grant the party a water element and also cause the enemies to be weak to the water element, will completely ignore the fact that the abilities that she's using are of a magic type base. So overall, this is just the first video to kind of go through this. I want to do more, just explaining more about Chaos and how to tackle it in the future. This also includes about what summon boards are, realizing weapons and such. I hope this has been an educational video for you, and I hope this helps, and all the best in Chaos in the future. Goodbye.